Hello everybody, and welcome to this day 2 of our live stream conference on partnering with business to promote human security and the SDGs, which is being organized by Esg Ideas and Rosario University in Colombia. We had a fantastic conversation yesterday. If you are joining us for the first time, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm Mary Martin. I'm the director of the UN Business and Human Security Initiative at LSE Ideas. Before we get into the business of today, I just thought it might be useful, whether you were here yesterday or not, to recap on some of those conversations we had yesterday to set the scene for what I think will be some further interesting insights today. We had 2 sessions yesterday. We began with the idea of human security as a way to recognize different forms of violence, including capitalism itself, and the need to humanize security as a way of dealing with those forms of violence, and to challenge them. So some of the questions posed were about how to guard against human security being captured by powerful actors. What are the processes that can ensure a different sort of people-centered security consciousness? How to connect different forms of agency and ensure participation and action. And we've reflected on different routes to that, such as international law, frameworks like the SDGs, but also consumer power as really powerful, which brought us, of course, to the whole idea of the private sector and its role. And the feeling was that human security gives the importance of the local context, which isn't always recognized or implemented by business, the possibility to get away from conversations about security that are elite focused, and the need really is to make businesses understand the different roles they can play in promoting human security and peace building, recognizing that when we're talking about the private sector, it's a diverse, heterogeneous entity. But there are potential overlaps between best practices that are used in business and best peace building practices. And I think we'll hear a bit more about that today as well. But there's also a role for government and regulators in ensuring even playing fields and in encouraging business contributions to peace. Then we had a fantastic range of experiences of multi-actor interventions, which involved the private sector. And that really reflected the diversity of perspectives and entry points in this very broad field of study. So we had companies focusing on engaging proactively in development, companies that were in conflict with local communities, coalitions and alliances involving international organizations like the UN, but also NGOs actively working to involve business partners in meeting development needs, whether they're in areas like energy, and we also heard about digital transformation. So some of the key messages, certainly that I took away from it, were the importance of place as a way of anchoring commitments between business and other actors, and in anchoring commitments to development and peace building and human security. The need for deep and ongoing dialogues between multiple actors, and for processes, many different kinds of processes that allow communities and individuals to be heard and put them on a more equal footing with companies. So processes that include communications, accountability mechanisms, grievance and redress, and the idea that trust is built by companies doing actions, not just speaking words. Even if that sounds like a very obvious statement, it doesn't always happen. But also perhaps softer forms like, or more generic forms like innovation and creativity are engines that can create positive cohesion between the private sector and communities to improve human security. So fantastic terrain on which to build today, and today's sessions, I think, offer us the opportunity to both dig down into some of those insights, into the details suggested by yesterday's discussion, and look at different ways to bring the private sector into human security initiatives, but also in our final session to, as it were, zoom back out again and think about what we know and what we need to understand further in terms of future research agendas. And just to remind you, we recorded yesterday's sessions. We will be recording today's, as you can see in the chat box, and we'll put the podcast on the LSE Ideas website. So go there to look for the recording if you want to replay and rethink some of our debates. So let me now turn over to the chair of our first session, Helena Puig, who is the director and founder of Build Up, which does great work on innovating practices for conflict prevention and countering polarization. And Helena, over to you.
Thank you so much, Marian. Thank you for inviting us all to this really interesting session. We're going to be focusing in this first session on different approaches and tools. So joining me on this panel and maybe you can wave so everybody can see you as we introduce you. Alexandra Abelo from LSE, Kate Roll from UCL, Marcel Smits from SG Impact, and Maria Lucia Mendez from FIP, and Janine Aguilera from LSE. So we have a series of presentations from the different speakers who will be introducing themselves in greater detail and providing their own insights and experiences on this issue of different approaches and tools. And following their initial presentations, I'll be asking each one of them a question so that we can go a little bit deeper into their experience. And then after that, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So have your questions ready, and I believe you have a Q&A function that you can use to submit questions so that we can then put them to the panelists. So with that very brief introduction, I'd like to hand it over first to Alexandra, who will be speaking about methodologies for working with communities. Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you, Helena. And thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this event. I'm very excited because this event is organized by Rosario University, my alma mater in Colombia, and also the LSE where I'm based now. So really happy to be here. And let me just make sure that you can see some slides that I have prepared for this session. Can I just get confirmation that you are?
You can see, we can see them.
Yeah, okay. Let me just minimize this. Okay, so you can see better. Well, like I said, I'm really happy to have this opportunity to share the work we have been doing in some of the Latin American and Caribbean cities. And in the time I have, I'm going to tell you about the methodological approach that Jenny Pierce, whom you heard yesterday, and I have co-developed with colleagues of the Observatory of Human Security in Colombia. This methodology, we have been adapting it and refining it in the last 10 years to work with particularly vulnerable communities in 11 cities in 6 countries of Latin America. We have worked in cities like Medellin, Tegucigalpa, Tijuana, Acapulco, San Salvador, and other cities that have made the headlines for having extremely high levels of violence. So these are some of the cities that have been mostly affected by the crisis of security and violence that we have seen in the region in the last 3 decades. So the aim of the methodology is co-constructing security from below. And a key driver of that methodology was our interest in understanding what does security means in context of chronic violence, and what does it mean for those who are the most vulnerable to the kind of problems we see in this context. And what we have been finding since 2009, when we started asking people on the ground about their understanding of security, is that people's notions of security really tell us a lot about how people's lives and livelihoods and rights in this context are constantly threatened not only by local gangs, by the violent clashes between criminal organizations for the competition of illegal economies, but also are threatened daily by poverty, by precarious work, by gender inequalities, by epidemics, institutional crisis, police violence, and corruption. So what these notions of security that people, show on the ground really resonate strongly with this multidimensional notion of human security. And it also shows that what people expect on the ground when they talk about security is not something that can be provided only through strengthening the military capacity of the state or through policing strategies that have been used in the region. So recognizing those notions, local notions of security, but also recognizing people's knowledge, people's capacity to think and act in this context, we developed this methodology to co-produce practice-oriented knowledge with the communities themselves. So the idea was that by working with different groups within these communities, we could co-produce participatory diagnosis of the problems that were affecting the human security in their different dimensions, but also identify solutions to those problems. The idea was then that we could rethink and understand better how is that violence is reproduced in this context, and also rethink security responses that are obviously not working in the region. And in order to do so, the methodology kind of was inspired by a lot of the contributions from Latin American thinkers like Falsborda, Paulo Freire, and other participatory approaches to research, but also by contributions from the field of peace studies. And the idea was that we could create a non-extractive form of knowledge production with communities. How we did this is the first step was to create a diverse research team that involved academic researchers, but also community researchers. These were members, residents of the community selected for the work that were interested in participating in this process of producing knowledge, but also were respected in the communities for the work they do for the welfare of the community. And we also included academic researchers in some cases. These were people who had some academic training, but also practical experience by working in civil society organizations. And the idea is that we will work together in this horizontal type of collaborative work that will allow us to create this dialogue and recognize the value that different types of knowledge that different actors have in society have. So we engage in this dialogue, so using the practical knowledge of the academics, the community researchers, the experiential knowledge, and also the academic knowledge that we have. We use it for developing this constructive dialogue, not only within the research team, but also with the communities. Also trying to be very explicit about adapting the research process to include different voices. So we work with groups of women, we work with groups of young people, children. We also include Afro-descendants or members of the LGBT community in some cases, or victims of forced displacement who were inhabiting these communities. So the idea was that by involving different actors and representatives of different groups within the communities, we could better understand the complexity of the problems of security in this context and how these problems were being experienced in a different way by different groups. To do that, obviously, we needed to be kind of creative and not only resort to traditional academic methods of research, like interviews, focus groups, but also look at the local practices. These communities and these groups have their own ways of systematizing and producing knowledge. So we combine these local knowledges with our academic training, and we use different methods. We use, in some cases, participatory video. We use cartography, mapping, graphic tours in some contexts to work with young people and young artists in Medellin, for example, but also community sewing and other kind of community techniques in order to nurture and enable these constructive dialogues. Then our research teams have the difficult task to systematize and condense these dialogues. And the idea was that we could produce something specific that will allow us to systematize the result of these dialogues. And we produce these human security agendas. These are just some examples of some of the ones we have produced. And these agendas contain the priority issues that were identified with the community according to different dimensions of human security, and give us an idea of what are the problems and how people understand the complexity of the problems that they experience in their communities. But also these agendas contain some solutions and some ideas, action points that were directed not just to state institutions, to local authorities, but also ideas of what can civil society organizations do in this context, what can community themselves do in order to address some of these complex problems. So these agendas became a useful tool, not only to make visible the problems that communities were experiencing, but also to allow, to make visible their voice as well in debates and local debates on security. And they also facilitate a different kind of community process that enabled the restoration of social fabric that in many contexts were weakened and destroyed almost because of insecurity and violence. And it allows us to engage with different actors, with academia, with members of Congress, for example, in the case of Mexico, with local authorities. So it became a very useful tool to engage with different actors in looking at solutions in this context. Obviously, I don't have the time enough to go through the wide range of learning that was accumulated through this process, but in dialogue with some of the things that we discussed in this event yesterday, I would like to highlight at least 3 points that I would like to conclude with. And the first one is that by using this methodology, we realize that it's possible to operationalize the human security concept, and to do it using a critical perspective that puts people's experiences and realities at the center of the whole process. Obviously, it's not easy, but it's possible then, to use human security to think how to address these complex problems on the ground. The second point I would like to make is that, again, it was very clear that agency is vital for sustainable solutions and transformations in this context, but that this agency needs to be enabled, it needs to be supported, and it needs to be supported through processes, sometimes long-term processes that enable collaborative participatory engagement with residents of these communities that are respectful of people's knowledges and capacities and ways of dealing with the problems. And a third point, I think, which is clear and I think is useful for the conversation here, is that co-producing knowledge with communities in this way can help us rethink how we are addressing these problems, not just rethinking public policies, but also the strategies and the initiatives civil society and the private sector and the communities themselves put in place. And I think this is important in order to be able to humanize security. So I'll leave it there. I know we're probably going to have more opportunity to discuss more issues in the questions section. And I'll just leave here some of the links where you could find more information about this work that we have produced. I'm just going to stop sharing my presentation here.
Thank you, Alexandra. And maybe one thing that you could do is you could put those links in the chat in case people didn't catch them when you were looking at them. But that was a really interesting exploration of this particular methodology to rethink security along human security grounds and really to do it with communities. So thanks for sharing that. And next, I would like to ask Kate Roll from UCL to do a short presentation, and she will be speaking about the role of new technologies in creating positive social and economic impact. So Kate, over to you.
Great, thanks so much. So I'm one of these sort of multi-hatted or multidisciplinary people. I did my doctorate in politics, looking at post-conflict transitions, and then moved to a business school. And now I'm looking at, now I work on public administration. So I've been sort of public, private, state, all across. But I think what I'm really mainly going to draw from here is when I was at the Society Business School in Oxford, I taught a course on tech for impact, which really came out of seeing the sort of techno-optimism there. And this was a real reaction to that. And what I was seeing was a lot of really well-intentioned initiatives, a lot of good intentions, but they really missed foundations in development or conflict studies and in science and technology studies. So I'll sort of draw from some of what I used for that course. So again, speaking to the role of new technologies in creating positive social and economic impact. And so like we're all taught to do as academics, we trouble the prompt, we challenge the prompt. And so I think the first question is, do technologies create impact? Can they be good? And when I raise this in a classroom, you know, the debate goes back and forth, but then usually a response that I get quite early on is no. You know, a hammer builds a house, but it can also tear one down. A gun can be carried by a peacekeeper or a game warden or by a kidnapper. So they say the sort of technology is neutral. And this is what we talk about as sort of a dual use problem in technology ethics. And you see this a lot. This is sort of the core of Facebook's argument. We are a neutral tool, we just enable interaction, which can be positive or negative. But if you push it further and you sort of go further in the literature, others say no. Technology is not without politics, it's not without intention, it's not neutral in this way. And I often show a video where Bruno Latour says, "The chair sits me." Not I sit in the chair sits me. Someone who designed that chair, designed that technology, is disciplining his body, his posture, his relationship to others. So it's not sort of neutral in this way. It's not, so we think we're rethinking neutrality, not in terms of use cases, but in terms of a technology as having a politics, having a history, having a designer, having a data set behind it. And this moves us away from this idea of technology creating a positive or negative impact, yes, no, to thinking about what it's doing and producing along with its intended use. So that's sort of a first core thing we need to think about when we take on this question. And the second, less abstract point is about this idea of technological determinism. You know, whether or not a technology produces impact really depends on its context. And dismissing this is what we call technological determinism, which is actually very common in tech for impact cases. And I think this is sort of the mortal sin of the very famous one laptop per child case. The idea that a technology can be sort of dropped from the sky and then make an impact. This is what a wonderful theorist called Warshauser calls the fire model, which makes me think of Prometheus coming down from Mount Olympus with his gifts to us mortals. But that's not how technologies worked. Technologies need to be linked up, both sort of physically and metaphorically. And so, you know, what is a mobile phone without credit or without a signal or without a charged battery? And really the point that usually gets missed, what is a mobile phone without someone useful to call? Right? So there's a whole social and physical infrastructure that needs to sit behind technologies. This also holds at the macro level in terms of national systems of innovation. We don't just talk about dropping technology from the sky and that's starting up new industries. We talk about these systems that include funding, universities, laws, norms, all sorts of stuff around that. And so we call this really the social envelope of technology. And this is something that all of us who've worked in low-income countries and developing countries already know. We've had reticulated water for millennia, but piping water is not a technological problem to be solved with life straws, but it's a political one. As William Gibson says, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. So I'll come to a close and we can return to all of this in the discussion. But, you know, what do these 2 points mean for peace tech or humanitarian tech and the role of technologies in creating positive social and economic impact? So, yes, there's clearly a role for technologies in positive impact. We see that in medicine. We see that in telecommunications. We see this in new safety equipment. We see this in innovation and economic growth, something that speakers spoke about yesterday. But there are 3 really big caveats. So the first is that technologies are not neutral or technical. They are social and carry their histories, and this affects how they work and the effects they produce. And the second, going back to that fire model, technologies are not automatic. They depend on context, and it's so often not really about the technology. And then finally, politics and power relations matter. This is where concerns with neo-coloniality come in, particularly around experimentation in humanitarian peace tech. The slogan of my institute is innovation is political. So we always ask, who controls the data? How do communications flow? Who is the buyer and who is the user? So what's the market formation? Who carries the risk of experimental technologies, particularly in a context where do no harm is important? And then what's the deal that's being made? This came up a little bit yesterday in terms of questions of, companies bringing people into the formal economy, but we have to think about on what terms when we think about things like adverse incorporation, gig work, platform work, all of that. So there's lots more to say, but I'll leave it there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kate. And that was quite a journey in a very short period of time over the different issues around tech neutrality and the complexity of social and political context. So thank you for that. I think we're sort of starting to build two different, those were two very different complex arguments, but we're starting to see a little bit about this issue of approaches and tools and how it really makes the question around human security in the private sector even more complex. So next up, we have Marcel Smits from SG Impact, who is going to be talking about measuring ESG impact. So Marcel, over to you.
Thank you, Helena. I'm going to share my screen as well. And Helena, I think the presentation that I'm going to give is about 6 minutes. I hope you don't mind.
I do not mind. I'll let you know at 6 minutes. So, I'll also let you know once I can see your slides, which is not quite yet. It says it's starting.
Yes.
There we go. Now I can see them.
You can see them? One second here. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Today I would like to present a new way to measure social impact of businesses operating in fragile and conflict-affected settings using the concept of human security and positive peace. I intend to show that how this approach enables companies to measure environmental, social, and governance ESG impact locally, and translate these, how to translate these impact measurements into contributions to the sustainable development goals. First, a bit about the challenges here in these settings for businesses. Over the years, there have been really growing expectations from both investors as well as from the public for business to create a higher ESG impact and contribute to the SDGs. Now, this automatically implies that companies that operate in such environments will need to look beyond current due diligence processes and do no harm approaches. And although many companies already have social environmental impact strategies and sustainability policies at their disposal, they seem to struggle to address complex and dynamic situations in fragile and conflict-affected settings. Now, part of the problem is that existing international standards fail to mitigate the negative impacts of corporate activities, especially on local communities, and there are no standards whatsoever on how to create positive impact. In fact, the standardized risk data that are used to inform companies' KPIs, key performance indicators today, do not give actual account of impact locally. Standards focus on environmental issues more so than over social aspects, and there's really no connection between the E in E and the S in ESG. And the S is also very limited in scope. The emphasis is mostly on reducing risks that are financially material. So with that, I mean it must have some sort of impact on either the amount of cash flow generated by the company or an external financing to the companies. Now, the challenge seems to be, going back one point. The challenge for companies is to reduce the complexity and assess multidimensional risks in FCS, in fragile and conflict settings that demonstrate the extent of the materiality or the relevance of these risks to the business. So when defining materiality of risks, we suggest that the focus needs to move away from company risks to more collective challenges faced by both companies and communities. And this is a good way to identify shared value and benefits in the form of human security, risk reductions, and positive SDG contribution. Now, in particular, community consultations will be valuable to identify the salient social issues and in the business risk assessment process. It's a way to really identify and track local material issues that tend to be more hidden. Examples are, the deep-rooted inequalities, for instance, infectious diseases, political repression, or group A tensions. Now, it's suggested, therefore, that human rights, security, and sustainable development need to be linked and assessed through more local stakeholder consultations. Now, in the next slide, in this table, shows how a human security approach can bring interrelated issues together and how it can clarify ESG issues by approaching them as multidimensional human rights, security, and development risks. And with regards to the SDGs, human security can inform how actions taken by companies on the SDGs can become more risk responsive. Now, the idea here is to reduce complexity and offer guidance to companies. So rather than pre-selecting SDGs based on the general alignment with the company's core business, as is typically the case today, we emphasize local human security risks to be the starting point in ESG impact measurement. In that way, any SDG contributions that will emerge can be directly connected to a real improvement in people's well-being. Now, we also should suggest that the application of human security business partnerships by LSE Ideas offers an essential bottom-up governance mechanisms through which companies and communities can determine the key ESG risk factors and clarify their materiality to the business and agree on impact measurements. Now, this is the last slide. Just to sum things up, in short, we think we found a new way to link materiality and responsibility for the purpose of the evaluation of company risk and impact. Human security reveals key local risks with potentially high impact for business and communities, which would typically be missed in current processes. Assessing local materiality of the risk offers clearer boundaries for corporate social responsibility. Now, the last point I would like to make is that we also think that the concept of positive peace will be of benefit here. The 8 positive peace pillars work as a system to evaluate the background conditions of human security. Positive peace can be used as a guidance for evaluating actions taken to address risks within the interconnected pillars. And the more pillars are addressed through the actions, the more human security guarantees are generated. Now, thank you for this. I just want to mention that the ideas were presented are described in more detail in a 2020 discussion paper and policy brief written by Mark van Dorp and myself at the request of LSE Ideas. And they were also discussed during a series of webinars held in 2020. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marcel, for that explanation of sort of the complexity of trying to really arrive at materiality in assessing some of these risks. And I think that just kind of is completing the story or the puzzle that we wanted to tell in this panel, right, with the different approaches and tools. And the last presentation is from Maria Lucia Mendez from FIP and Janine Aguilera from LSE. Who will be talking about building trust and partnerships. So over to you.
Hi, Helena. Thank you very much. Let me share my screen very quickly. Can I confirm that you?
Yeah, we can see it.
The slides.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let me. Sorry, just a few seconds. Okay. So I hope that. Sorry, just I'm having internet problems with the. Okay. So first, we would like to thank SG Ideas and Universidad del Rosario for the invitation to present this trust measuring tool that we have named Yo Confío, which means I trust in English. And also thank you, big thanks to the audience for your presence today. And just a quick note, I will be speaking today, but the Director of Business and Peace Building Division is also present in this panel, and she may jump in during the Q&A. So during the following minutes, I will only give you a brief overview of the tool together with some key findings. I hope that is fine if I take 6 minutes. So it is key to start straightforward by explaining the importance of measuring trust. Trust is a ubiquitous element that promotes or hinders human relationships and interactions in any given context, of course, particularly in complex environments that confront a conflict or its aftermath. The social fabric very often ends up broken or highly damaged, and relationships between communities, the private sector, and local authorities are inexistent due to a high mistrust. This, of course, will hinder the willingness for dialogue, cooperation, and therefore the possibility to build partnerships for development or even reconciliation. And speaking from our experience as researchers and practitioners, we firmly believe that the path to building partnerships for development should start by building trust in the first place. And today in Colombia, after a conflict of more than 60 years, 77% of the citizens think that you cannot trust others, and 83% of respondents do not trust the business sector in Colombia again. So how do we measure and transform trust? That's the big question. So based on an extensive theoretical review of different authors and instruments implemented in Colombia and other countries such as South Africa, we found that trust can be measured when it is understood as a behavior. As a result, we developed our survey, which includes approximately 29 questions that explore the respondents' perception of trust in the private and public sector and members of the local community as well. So the psychometric model developed by a data scientist of the team translates the results of the trust perception survey into an index that ranges between 0 and 1, 0 meaning not trust at all, and 1 meaning full trust. Today, we have surveyed more than 1,100 people across 14 municipalities in Colombia of the private and public sector and the community, including migrants and former guerrilla combatants. So when we speak about the variables that inform the questions of the survey, we refer to these 5 elements that, according to our research, are present or absent in human interactions or relationships and can impact individuals' trust behavior. Overall, we have found that honesty could be the variable that higher impacts the final perception of trust, and the lack of transparency, of course, the inadequate use of information and the low perception of good faith on the part of businesses reinforces negative stereotypes and old beliefs. And we have also found that the most untrustworthy actor in most of these Colombian regions is the private sector, unfortunately, even in areas where corruption is high and public institutions are poorly regarded. So in conclusion, this tool balances the value of perception measurements versus social impact measurements. It is true that intangibles are difficult to measure and perceptions vary in short periods of time. However, if our aim is to create partnerships between actors traditionally in conflict, we need to capture and understand local perceptions and definitions of trust, analyze the variables that are hindering or allowing this behavior, and then make decisions on what to improve in order to transform the local tensions. Trust is hardly transformed through scattered efforts like communication strategies and or informal separate encounters between the private sector and communities. Trust is effectively transformed through a process in which training with the communities takes place, a formal set of dialogue tables is held, and a consortium forums for specific cooperative actions are established. So let me hand over back to you, Helena, to allow some time for Q&A. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Janine, for that very interesting presentation from LSE and Fundación Ideas para la Paz. That was really, really interesting on how to measure trust. And that concludes the set of presentations from the different panelists. I think it's a very rich set of methods and tools that was shared here, approaches and tools, talking about, initially about understanding the complexity of human security through methodologies for working with communities, understanding the sort of the role and the interaction of technology with issues of human security, so this idea of non-neutrality, it not being automatic, the importance of politics and power mattering, talking about how to connect to materiality and a real measurement of materiality with Marcel's presentation, and then finishing on this idea of how can we measure trust as a behavior to really understand human security. So the floor is now open for questions. Since I know that it often takes a little bit of time for people to come up with their own questions, just a reminder, you have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can start to type in questions for any of the panelists. I'm going to take advantage of being the chair to ask some questions that I have or that came up for me as you were all speaking. Alexandra, I actually would like to address my first question to you. You spoke about how your one of the core reasons for implementing the kind of methodology that you use, whether you end up using participatory video or cartography or sewing, but this idea of working with communities was part of it is really to understand the complexity of human security. But part of it is not just about inclusion, but also about agency. So about communities having agency about this understanding of human security and what they can do about it. I wanted to throw that back to you and ask you to kind of go a little bit deeper, because the challenges of human security can seem overwhelming to a lot of people. And somehow, I certainly in my experience, when people get a deeper understanding of everything that they do, there's a community assessment of human security, there can also be frustration at the lack of agency. So how do you deal with those expectations, and what's your sense in working with communities of whether there really is agency after there's a participatory definition of human security?
Thank you, Helena. I think that's a very important question, and I think has been at the core of our thinking around methodology. This idea that in order to understand what is happening in these communities, we also want to understand what do people do in this context about the problems they experience. So the first kind of step into discussing agency is actually understanding, that people who live in this context are not passive subjects of the reality, right? That they actually deploy many actions to actually survive in this difficult context. So one part of the process within the methodological kind of process is first asking the community themselves and recognize what do we do in the community to deal with these problems. And then we start actually mapping this type of actions. Some of these actions that people take to survive actually make the problem worse. So there is and also this process of conscientization, right? This process of critically understanding what we're doing that actually make the problem worse. So we just not understand, we try to discuss with community not only what the state is doing that makes the problems worse, words, but also what residents are doing. And also we start mapping activities or actions that actually help the community. And we find that even in the most difficult context where people stop talking to their neighbors, where people are enclosed in their neighborhoods because they're so scared of even leaving, letting their children play outside. Even in this context, you always find that people take actions, and some of these actions actually help in different ways to support either to reduce the impact of these problems of human security, but also to actually find solutions. So this first part of conscientization about what people are doing, it's very important because it actually makes people conscious of their own agency. And then the second step, when we think about action, so there is this risk of having, when we deploy or we make the list of proposals to municipal authorities or institutional, to institutions of the state or civil society, we realize that these actions might take a lot of time to actually be implemented or even be listened by authorities. But the fact that we also identify actions that will be taken by the communities themselves give them a little bit of this sense that we can actually start working on human security and improving our conditions, even when other actors are not doing it yet, right? But also the process itself, the process of establishing dialogues within the community is actually part of the enabling this agency. So it is not just hoping that the problem will be solved at the end of the process, but actually sitting and discussing. For example, just to give you a little example, in some of the communities we have, when we talk to young people talk about how they feel threatened, stigmatized by the adults in the community. And then when we talk to adults in the community, they tell us about how they see young people as a threatening force, they're scared, but they see them in the corners. And through the research process that might take 1 or 2 years, we actually enable dialogues, intergenerational dialogues within their own community that help each other understand what they are experiencing, how they are seeing the problems different in the community, and sometimes find solutions within their own community. So I think by seeing that actions can be taken at different levels, at the local community, city level, it kind of helps us kind of take a little bit perspective of these solutions and get away from the despair that, the complexity of these problems might bring.
Thank you, Alexandra, and I appreciate your positivity in that response as well, because I think it's also important to keep that in mind. So thanks for that. There's one question that has come in through the Q&A, and actually I had a very similar question, so I'm going to put them both together and address them to the speakers. So the question, I'm not sure who it's addressed to, but it says, where does the ordinary man or woman fit into this type of system? And I think I had a similar kind of question coming up while Marcel spoke about the kind of impact assessment, and also while Janine spoke about the measuring trust as a behavior and the trust index. The question that I had is, how do you find that your work might connect with what communities themselves think about human security and about what they can do vis-a-vis the private sector when it comes to human security? And I think in particular, in the case of Janine, I would love it if you tell us a little bit about, you mentioned briefly that communities, that it's important to involve communities, but how do you find that communities understand the index that you've created? Does it actually speak to them? So this idea of how does it connect to, how do these measures of human security connect to the ordinary man or woman? So maybe Janine, if I could ask you to go first, and then Marcel, if you would also take that question.
Yes, thank you very much, Helena, for that very interesting question. And yeah, definitely this tool, I would start by saying that this tool allows us to, is stemming from research, but is also allowing us to understand trust at the local level. And we, in the beginning of the survey, the first 2 questions of the survey actually asked the respondent to define first, what does trust mean for them? Usually trust can be, the level of trust could be affected by how safe you feel, and also by like what are the dangers that the presence of the private sector would represent for them, not only in terms of the personal safety, but in terms of the sense of belonging, the cultural beliefs, how the dynamics at the local level are changing due to the presence of the private sector. So all these elements are reflected in these first responses. And then other questions are asked to the respondent that are gonna give a sense on what is important for decision making, also for public policy, when we are trying to create partnerships for development. So all these variables are actually present in our daily lives, not only in the business sector, but also in the community daily life. And they kind of reflect in their responses how these variables are connected to the different dimensions of human security, and how safe they could feel if trust is improved in that regard. So I also feel that it's a tool that could materialize the link between human security and positive peace, because basically positive peace means coexistence, and to have positive coexistence, we need to first understand how are the interactions at the local level, what is the basis of these interactions, how do we build trust on the basis of this definition, and then how do we create partnerships, how do we bring the private sector to create partnerships based on those local understandings, instead of bringing a classic definition of trust and a classic definition of cooperation and a classic definition on how to build partnerships.
Thanks, Janine. And Marcel, what about you on these questions?
Yeah, I've been thinking about how I'm gonna address that question. You know, this what we're suggesting and how it speaks to local people. First of all, it's what we've done is conceptually, and it's and we've looked at how it's, you know, a better system than what is out there today. Other types of processes that in particular reaches out to local people and that can speak to them. And this human security fits in that sense well, rather than over human rights based kind of approaches that are very much applied by companies today. You know, companies look at child labor issues in their supply chain, but that may not be an immediate concern for family who needs food on the table. You know, who needs, so that's where the difference is. And, you know, people understand that what water means to them for their daily life, or electricity, and they want to be out there walking safely. And again, they want to make sure that there is, you know, wages are making sure that they can live from these wages. So that's the difference, and that is really not what's happening today in current processes, which, like I said, surprisingly, there's a lot of, maybe not surprising, there's a lot of focus on environment and what companies do in the immediate surrounding in terms of environment. But when it comes to more social issues and people's issues, it's very narrow towards their supply chain only, not so much in the environment. And we know connections between the environment and, you know, other social issues. So, you know, we know that environmental degradation can lead to displacement, but that step is not being made today. So there's wider concept, wider impact, and that's what we're trying to do here is to see how processes can be changed and actually, but also fit to what's already being done, but to build on it and showing that it's actually less complicated if you take local people first as the starting point rather than the company. So that's what this is about.
Thanks, Marcel. And I know that was a very broad question to address, but I think that was, you provided a very good link also to some of the other questions that are coming in, which are really about, okay, so we have these measures, but how do we now try to actually affect people in the private sector to consider some of these human security issues? And one of the questions that's come in through the chat is directed at Kate. It's from Catherine Nwajiko Dahu. at ODI. And she writes, you reflected on the importance of situating innovation within context and acknowledging the political. And so her question is then, is there an appetite or interest on part of tech actors and those who are enthusiastic about their role for seriously considering context? Are there incentives to encourage them to consider context more systematically? So Kate, over to you.
Yeah, a super question. So there's a few different pieces to come at this. So I think a lot of tech actors, you know, if you're thinking about you're working on an app that supports refugees, they see that as political. So they're engaged with it, sort of the politics in that sense, and I think are very open and very engaged on that front. But I think where the sort of the politics isn't seen so much, or it isn't understood so much, is on things like you set up a big biometric data set for refugees, and then a program closes. Who gets that data? What data sets does it get merged with? And then what are the implications for people and their movements? Those kind of sort of, you know, one of the interesting things about technology is that saying it's a technical problem and has a technical solution often strips that kind of politics out of it. So we can think about, you know, refugee movements as political, but who holds the data set we don't think of as political, whereas I actually think that second part is extremely interesting. So I think some of that is, you know, sort of an awareness thing, maybe a planning, you know, we all know in humanitarian context, you're very reactive. So having a sense of what happens next, I think is often a missing piece, and is very normal when you've got so much of experimentation going on, but obviously quite problematic. I think the other piece, and this is maybe the more cynical response, is with a lot of humanitarian technologies, you're sort of saying, who is it for and who does it serve? And I think that's another sort of form of politics that maybe we don't see so much. So, and when I say this, it's, you know, we end up with these funny markets where the user isn't the buyer. The data is collected, or you know, the information is for a donor rather than for the user. And I think that's a sort of set of politics that we don't see so much. So that sort of transmission belt that we think of with innovation, where a consumer either likes it or doesn't, or gives feedback and then it's refined, that doesn't necessarily happen, because the buyer and what they need from the technology might be quite different from what the user experiences and needs from that technology. So it's kind of an awareness of that. And until that sort of market dynamic shifts, and we see this in assistive technologies, we see this all over, I think it's very hard to sort of close that gap. Where you do see that, I think in some places, is where governments are developing technologies to serve citizens, because I think that feedback loop is stronger. And they're very much of politics. But these questions of where does data go, who controls it, who is served, these are really interesting questions and important. So I think there's an awareness of politics, but maybe not some of these sort of data politics or structural politics underneath.
Thanks, Kate. We have another question for Alexandra, and this is from Vesna Alexandra. And she's asking, what is the experience of implementing locally co-created human security agendas? So maybe just to share a concrete experience of that. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for the question. Yes, I think the experience kind of varies in depending on the context. So we have, you know, experiences where, you know, the security agendas were able to be adapted and kind of adopted by community organizations on the ground that gave it sustainability, and they have been kind of make it part of their own agenda for action in their communities, and that gave, you know, the possibility of implementing many of the community solutions and action points, you know, in the short term, let's say, more effectively. But there were other contexts in which there was, for example, a less rich history of social organizations. So the civil society or the social fabric was more weakened, and that has been a bit more difficult to implement. So I would say, you know, it varies depending on at least two factors, that the history of social organization in the communities, but also the political will as well. I remember the agendas also have action points and proposals for the state institutions and civil society organizations. So there is also a margin of, so we cannot control how much the local authorities and policymakers actually, take these ideas, to change their own initiatives. But that political will can shift. And the issue of that is being a middle and long-term process allows that sometimes, when the time comes, the opportunity arises, when there is a community, a change in government, for example, and is more willing to listen, then some of the people who are participating in these processes then take their agenda and push for changes. So in Tegucigalpa, for example, we have some of the women who participated in the process. They were able to kind of call local authorities into an open cabildo, kind of like a mini open assembly, and they were able to get a sitting place in the local board for security, the Mesa de Seguridad, the Distrito Local. So this is the local district board for deciding security strategy. So that, for example, has allowed us to have more sustainability and more impact in local policy at the local level. In other contexts, for example, in Apatzingán, when there was a weaker kind of civil society, some citizen groups decided to create a network, and then they are taking the agenda and some of these initiatives as an excuse to kind of mobilize their capacities and create a more sustainable process at the local level. So it varies, how the process obviously develops. But what we see again is a mix of, what can be done in the short term, but also what can be done in the middle and the longer term.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Alexandra. That's very interesting. We have another question, this time directed at Marcel. And the question is, what is in a name? So he says that, Marcel, you spoke of combining possibly human security and positive peace to assist ESG activities. The question is, from Jonathan Collier, but he's saying, I'm curious in Marcel's and panelists' personal experiences, which term or which words resonate more with businesses being engaged in this work? And what are the reactions to both human security and positive peace? So Marcel, since this was addressed at you, why don't you start first, and then we can see if others have things to say about this.
Sure. No, it's a good question. We actually had a number of discussions last year with businesses when we first introduced these concepts. I was actually surprised how open many companies that were present were to these ideas. So I thought it would be much more resistance to positive peace. What is that? Usually the businesses don't like to talk about peace very much, and they don't think it's relevant to their business, in the sense that they don't think they have a role to play. But in this case, there was certainly, I would say positive feedback that we received, but at the same time resistance to the concept, to doing actually more than what they're already doing now, and that can be frustrating. So they get it. They also understand that there are push and pull factors, right? I mentioned investors. I mentioned greater demands from public to do better, to do good, and we keep on seeing the bad examples that are coming out, and which is a bit frustrating, because it does show that what's being done today doesn't really work very well, and so there is also that understanding. But to make a lot of the companies feel, I couldn't say a lot of the companies, the ones that I've been engaging with, feel like they're, the SDGs framework, their human rights framework, the global compact, and putting them all together, and then having additional things to worry about. Now human security, now positive peace. Yes, there is an understanding what they're doing is not sufficient, but to take that step and start, let's say, apply it or experiment with it has yet to come in a way. And meanwhile, we do see that there keep on bumping their noses at the moment, and that it doesn't work very well. And with that, I must say that the understanding of dynamics and complexities on work, operating or investing in fragile and conflict-affected countries is really missing. There is not a good understanding about how that there is, different things, a certain aspect to worry about, and it's sort of, what you apply in one country is the same in another, and that's a shame.
I think you're right that companies can sometimes have a reaction of, oh, now I have to worry about this too. I'm reminded of some of the conversations that I've had at times in my work, particularly with tech companies, when it comes to worrying about polarization on platforms. I should warn you that we may be about to be joined by a fifth panelist who wasn't invited. Okay, no, he's going away. Apologies about that. I have a childcare issue. So one of the things that happens with tech companies sometimes is that they have spent a lot of time worrying about content moderation and hate speech on their platforms. And when you add polarization, they say, do I really need to worry about this too? And what does this term even mean? It's too complex. It's too difficult to understand and to measure. So very similar to some of the issues you're raising with human security. But over the years, they've started to adopt that language as well, right? And I feel something similar may be happening with the term human security. And actually, Kate, if I could put you on the spot, I'm curious to know whether you've heard tech companies use these terms, technology companies in particular, use these terms, human security or positive peace, when they think about engaging with communities, whether that's something that's happening at all.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not sure, the discourse that I've been tracking probably closest is sort of humanitarian tech, peace tech. And so a lot of tech for good, tech for impact, a lot of those kind of discourses, and innovation and that kind of language is really central. Doing well by doing good. All of that, I think, comes up more than sort of language from conflict studies or language from peace studies. So that's sort of my off the cuff response. But just from being sort of at business schools, impact is so key. SDGs, there's sort of laggards coming along and getting very interested in that. So, but SDG 16 is such a small part of that, and I think all of us can sort of critique the way conflict is discussed and human rights are discussed in SDG 16. So, I don't know quite how far that gets us. But I would say generally those terms aren't forefront in my experience, but others might know more.
Janine and Alexandra, do you have anything to comment on this question in particular? And Janine, go ahead.
Yes, sure. So I think I'm going to start speaking, but just a heads up that if Maria Lucia wants to jump in, more than welcome. So yeah, human security is quite new. It's a concept quite new in Colombia, but positive peace or business and positive peace building is not new at all. Actually, the Ideas for Peace Foundation is a local think tank that started as an initiative of entrepreneurs and private companies, the biggest private companies at the moment, at that moment in Colombia. Right now is funded mainly by international donors, but this organization and many others, local think tanks in Colombia, are funded by the private sector because they recognize the costs of not doing anything at all in a conflict setting, costs related to reputational capital that usually per year represent millions of dollars for them, or costs related to personal safety of their employees, or costs related to their infrastructure. Usually terrorists attacks happen to their infrastructure. So it's not positive peace building is not new at all in Colombia. And I feel that it's a really interesting case because in Colombia, the private sector is very involved and is very interested in contributing to peace building and research.
Thanks, Janine. I think that's really interesting to think about it in the context of Colombia in particular. And Alexandra, I wonder if you have anything to say about that as well.
I mean, just in terms of the concept of human security, it really has not, gained track in Latin America. I think, the debate about security has been completely dominated by, citizen security, public security, in Colombia specifically democratic security. So the notion of human security has not really kind of attracted the attention, at least from policymakers and the business sector. But as Janine was saying, the concept of peace has actually, kind of sparkled a debate about, if we are in this process of building peace and more territorial and localized understandings of peace, then what kind of security model do we need that can support and enable that construction of peace? And we have, I would say, we have taken the opportunity to kind of start, fitting into that debate about, whether these traditional notions of security actually that are more associated with, maintaining order or keeping the social order rather than transforming, society, which is what you assume with these notions of positive peace, might enable us to think about an alternative understanding of security. And I would say at the local level, at least at the grassroots level, that has, this notion of security, human security has actually got attention, at least in the context of Medellin, for example. And we have seen actually from below a push towards getting human security recognized as an approach that addresses, in a better way, the kind of complex realities on the ground. And in the last, at least 2 administrations, at least, for example, in Medellin, in the second biggest city in Colombia, we have seen, for example, local authorities including the notion of human security within their development plans and development programs. Then there is a debate, and there's a debate about what they understand of human security and how they might co-opt the concept, not necessarily, in the same way that we do or understanding. And we have even, I would just say something, it's a funny, worrying, but it's paradoxical kind of incident we had in Medellin as well. After working for 10 years with this notion of human security from below with community organizations and grassroots actors, we were surprised, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, when there was an announcement, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the city, who was actually, kind of suggesting kind of a peace, kind of truce or a process to reduce violence in the city. And they actually resorted to this idea that we are doing this, or we should have a dialogue with the state to help improve human security in the city. So even criminal organizations had got kind of attracted to this notion. So, I mean, there is this issue about how much attention it gets, but also that, when powerful actors get attention and they get attracted to these concepts, they don't, empty it from the kind of meaning and the context of what they, how we discuss about them.
Yeah, and I think this what you're saying now connects to a question that Mary wanted to address to all of you, because there is this issue, right, about the fact that communities comprise many different interests, and companies also have multiple levels and different types of internal functions. So the question that Mary had is, how do all of your approaches and tools, or each of your approaches and tools, synthesize this diversity? How can they practically address the issue of non-homogeneous entities with different functions, different interests, to arrive at whether it's an aggregate barometer of trust or what a neutral application of technology might be? So maybe if I could ask Kate, would you like to take a shot at that first, and then we can go around the different speakers?
Yeah, it's a great question, and actually one that probably connects with a different set of work on corporations and poverty reduction. I did interviews in a large food company in Indonesia that was looking at childhood health and school feeding. And we interviewed up and down the organization, and they all understood the purpose of the project very differently. So the marketing team understood it as a form of market research, a loss-leading way of understanding if kids who are older would also drink this powdered milk product. Dutch managers who were over in the Indonesia office saw it as a form of charity. a way of giving back, of giving milk to children just like they'd had when they were children. The executives in the European head office had a very different view and saw it on a global scale tied to Business Roundtable and all this other stuff. And we wrote a paper about this, talking about this different understanding at different levels, and we're threatened with being sued. So they were really not keen to have this idea of diversity within an organization out there. And we're very resistant to talking about how social impact programs, or these things that are seen as doing well by doing good, can serve corporate interests and can serve multiple and maybe even conflicting interests. So, maybe that's more of a response to the question than an answer, but to say absolutely, you see lots of different motivations. And I think this has come up throughout in terms of talking about working in conflict and risk management, reputational management, doing, being a positive influence, and those all coexisting. I think maybe the only thing to say is my view from studying that corporation was that this was a positive, not a negative, in some way, that this program, which was ostensibly positive, was being championed by multiple parts of the organization, actually made it stronger rather than made it weaker, which was their view. So I think if companies can be motivated, or tech companies can be motivated to work in certain ways that are quote unquote positive, that's being held and reinforced by different parts of the firm. That's actually better than if there's sort of everyone's on the same, working on it for the same reason, perhaps.
Would one of the other speakers have a thought on this question?
Maybe I can jump in. So the issue of non-homogeneous entities or communities is addressed through our tool, the trust measuring tool. Is addressed through the recognition of different perspectives of the concept. So we basically analyze the data disaggregated by gender, by type of actor. So it would be whether the respondent is part of the community, the private sector, or the local authorities. We also analyze it based on age. So whether the respondent is youth, adult, and we then kind of build a cross-cutting analysis, trying to understand how the definition of trust will vary amongst these groups of people, trying to understand also where's the common ground, and also how can we leverage the perspective of vulnerable communities or traditionally excluded portions of the society. So for instance, females in the case of Colombia, and we try to bring that up and give it the importance that these perspectives deserve. And we also share back the results with the population, kind of drawing on this analysis, like the cross-cutting analysis. And also we think that if we were to build partnerships, the results of the trust measuring tool should be analyzed in the same way. If we are working in a community in which females have been traditionally excluded, then we will kind of flag the results or the perceptions or the understandings of female respondents in that community to kind of bring them on board in this partnerships building process.
Thanks, Janine. That's very interesting. Marcel, you wanted to address this question also?
Yeah, I guess. What I would say is that this is exactly why I think measurements can help. Because each situation is different. You're dealing with different people, different situations. One of the reasons why we haven't come up with like a set of indicators or something for this exercise that we did is because it will not work in one area, one region, or one dealing with one community or diverse group of people will be completely different elsewhere. and I think what we're also talking about is essentially, the process, and each time having to define human security with the people that we're dealing with. For one, it's different than for others. That's the trick here, and that's part of the reason I think when it relates to the previous question, why human security sometimes is difficult to sell in a way, because it's it's get a lot mixed up with human development, or and that or it's so different for many people. And in order to speak to the people or speak to different groups of people, you will have to keep on but it kind of repeat that whole exercise. And I guess it's that that process of engagement, and this is why for instance the human security business partnerships or policy ideas comes into force here, because that is supposed to kind of just extract all that information that you need. But yeah, you got to be watchful for in a way for what are you measuring here? Are you measuring really everything that you're around human security that applies in a particular area? One of the reasons why we brought in also the issue of positive peace is that whereas human security is very individually oriented, the positive peace is much more in the environment and the conditions. So people may be poor on one end, but the positive peace aspect would show perhaps that there are opportunities, or where the lack of opportunities actually exist. Whether the access exists for certain people over others to resources. And therefore it's that that combined use that would work in terms of identifying where essentially you need to put your efforts in terms of developing human security. And that's what comes to mind at the moment.
Thanks, Marcel. And I think, Alexandra, you had something to say as well. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I want to say about this issue of diversity that we see it very clear. I mean, when we try to build security agendas in different communities of the same city, even in the same area, the agendas will look different, because the kind of, the kind of problems that might be affecting different dimensions of human security, and they play out, the interconnection between those problems will be different in specific neighborhoods, for example, depending on which groups live there. There is a very kind of specificity about the local dynamics of insecurity, of human insecurity. As a result, the proposals that are, emerging after doing this process are very different for what needs to be done in community 1, different community 2. But saying that, we always see that we have to recognize we are taking an intentional approach. I mean, we are being specific about understanding those dynamics of human insecurity from the perspective of the people who live there, not necessarily from the perspective of the local authorities or even the police officers, for example, although we have dialogues with these different actors. We kind of prioritize on how people are experiencing these problems. And what we find that there is resonance, and there is something that is common in all the contexts, even across different cities of the region, is that this notion of security, of human security, is connected to this notion of the protection of rights and the well-being. And at the end, the same thing that we always find is that my security depends on the security of others. So I think that there is a space for dialogue. I mean, although we have done this process in various different contexts, we can see that the importance is actually mapping how the system of insecurity is working in each of these contexts, but there is room for dialogue across, especially in the cities that have complex problems of chronic violence. You see very similar kind of dynamics that might lead you to, to scale up. So for example, and I'm just going to finish with that. In Mexico, we work in 4 different cities. So one city in the North Tijuana, one city in Acapulco, one city in Nuevo León, in Monterrey, so we have 4 very different contexts with different population groups, but we were able to use the 4 agendas and then scale up and find what was relevant at the national level. And then you could see some, kind of useful kind of action points, at least for the policy circles, that could be leading to national reforms or national policies. So I will say, while we need to kind of balance the diversity that we find at the local level, it is possible using the human security approach to identify what kind of dynamics you need to deploy, at the city level and also at the national level.
Thanks, Alexandra. And I think I'm going to use your final points there, as well as Marcel's, to kind of come to a close on this panel. It's really interesting because it's been such a wide-ranging discussion, right? Which I think in a way, it just points to the fact that there are very different kinds of tools that are appropriate for this area of human security and business. And I think, you've all, although you've talked about very, very different approaches and tools, you've all touched on certain points that are common. One of them is this kind of danger. I think actually it was you, Alexandra, who talked about the danger of something being co-opted and then emptied out. The concept of human security, because it's so complex, ending up being empty and just being watchful of that risk. You've also all talked about the importance of really recognizing the diversity of perspectives about human security, and therefore having to involve communities in one way or another in understanding what human security really is. And then finally, I think one thing that none of you mentioned directly, but that I was thinking about as you all talked about your different work, is that a lot of your work is about translating what is the impact of the private sector on human security as a way of encouraging the private sector to adopt the responsibility towards human security. And so this idea of the translation and the importance of measurement, as Marcel put it, I think it came through from all of you very much. So thank you so much for that very rich and interesting discussion.